Thomas L. Pearcy, a professor of history at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania, previously taught at Brigham Young University for 7 years, and we were very pleased when he was our Latin American Studies coordinator here at the Kennedy Center. And he's also taught at 5 other universities throughout the Americas. He's the author of 5 books and many scholarly articles. He's been a senior Fulbright scholar to Panama and continues to work with the U.S. Department of State in various capacities. Professor Pearcy received an MA in American History from Purdue University and a PhD in Latin American History from the University of Miami. Pearcy, his wife, and their 3 children have loved traveling in Latin America and are currently enjoy living in close proximity to family in the East. As I mentioned, he'll be speaking on Central America in Transition, A Circular History. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Pearcy.
I'm pleased to be back at the Kennedy Center at BYU and to see so many of my friends and colleagues here, as well as so many students interested in cultures and history and political science and Central America. It's an honor to be here with you today. Looking out the window here, I'm reminded when I first went to Slippery Rock University, I'd been living here for 7 years. I loved the mountains, and when I got off the airplane, they were selling the university to me, and they said, "Do you want to see our ski lodge?" And I looked around, and I said, "You've got a ski lodge?" They said, "Yeah, well, this is where the faculty take their retreats." It really is a garage in some hills, but it passes as their ski lodge, I guess. I would call it a sledding lodge, or more appropriately, an Allegheny speed bump. I was pleased to see that Dr. Brooks is going to be speaking here in a couple of days. I first met Dr. Brooks in Managua, Nicaragua. He really is one of the young shining stars in the foreign service of our country, and has done a tremendous job in Latin America representing our country. He actually established a program that I have participated in several times where American scholars go into Latin American countries and teach U.S. economic history or some other form of history, but in Spanish to party officials, military soldiers, university educators, with the idea being that the more they know about us, I guess the more they'll like us or the less they'll dislike us. I've been to Nicaragua several times. Given the recent outcome of their presidential election, I'm not entirely sure how effective I was, but I enjoyed getting down there, even though they did re-elect Danny Ortega. As I suspect many of you know, Central America is beautiful. One of the things visitors to the region first notice is that topographically, the flora and fauna, it's a lush, beautiful place to visit, to live. We, certainly in the United States, but in academic circles, I think everywhere, we tend to lump these 7 countries all together and call it Central America. Most of my colleagues at Slippery Rock would not say that they're going to Europe on vacation. They're going to France or they're going to England, but we say we're gonna study Central America. These countries really are quite diverse, with dozens of different language groups. Many of them have very, very little in common, and in some instances they don't even really like each other very much. So being lumped together in one group under the umbrella of Central America sometimes isn't very useful. But for purposes of my comments today, I do want to identify some common characteristics that these 7 countries have that we can use to analyze and to study them. If you watch the headlines at all on the internet, on television, you see Central America right now is undergoing some very interesting changes. Guatemala most recently elected a leftist president, the first leftist president in 50 years. Last year, Nicaragua elected the head of the Sandinista party. Meanwhile, in Costa Rica, foreign investment is increasing and the economy continues to diversify. In El Salvador, their textiles industry and other industries are really taking off. So it's a complex place with a lot of different things going on at the same time, but with some commonalities that if we identify them, if we flesh them out and look at them, make this area, I think, comprehensible, a little easier to understand. Some of the things that they do have in common, pardon me, are geography and demography. These countries, compared to other countries in Hispanic and Luso-America, geographically are very, very small. They have comparatively limited raw materials, comparatively smaller populations to draw workers from, and smaller populations of skilled labor. Just a couple of examples. Guatemala is roughly the same size as Virginia. 13% of its land is arable, and you have 14.5 or thereabouts million people living there. Nicaragua is about the same size as the state of New York. 16% of its land is arable, and it has between 5 and 6 million inhabitants. Honduras is slightly larger than Virginia, and only 10% of its land is arable. Much of Honduras countryside is pretty inhospitable. These characteristics, limited geography, comparatively smaller labor force, over time, and at least in recent history, have contributed to other issues, other realities. The seven Central American countries, rather, have undergone considerably less economic diversification, say, than their sister states in South America. This is a very important thing for you to understand as you study the region. Whereas in Chile, if one area of the agricultural economy or the other collapses or there's a problem, you have the mining industry, nitrates generally, you have the automobile industry, the medical, the technology industry. It's a very diverse, complicated economy that can absorb large numbers of unemployed workers should a crisis occur. The same could be said for Argentina, for Brazil, for that matter, for Bolivia, Colombia, Mexico. But the seven Central American countries have experienced far less economic diversification. Now, the confluence of these realities, a fairly small population of skilled labor, smaller geography, and less economic diversification, along with a lot of other historical realities, has contributed, among other things, to inequitable income distribution, far more so even than other parts of Latin America. Salvadoran scholar Enrique Baloira noted that as late as 1970 in El Salvador, the upper class constituted less than 0.25% of the population. The middle class, approximately 2.5%, and the working class, everything else. So somewhere around 96% of Salvador's population, Baloira, a Salvadoran scholar, is classifying as worker, urban or rural. All of these things together, throughout at least the modern history of the region, have contributed to some phenomena that tend to repeat themselves. As I was putting together this talk and thinking about what I might say, I came up with this wonderful title for my comments, and it was very academic. It had colons and semicolons, italics and boldface. And my wife looked at it. She said, "What are you trying to say?" I said, "What I really want to say is that history kind of repeats itself. And in Central America, more so than other areas in the hemisphere." She said, in her logical way, "Then why don't you say that?" Hence the circular history of Central America. Over time, three primary groups in Central American societies have competed, if you will, for space, have competed for precious raw materials, have really and sometimes competed for life. The workers, the landed elite, and the security forces, whatever we might call them, whether it's the National Guard or the military or the police, those three components of society have tended to dominate, recent history anyway, in modern Central American history. Prior to the Great Depression in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when the sugar economy, for example, in El Salvador would slump, those who owned the property would have to take extraordinary measures. The workers maybe would begin to organize, would rise up, would complain about their living or working conditions. And this really backed landowners into a corner. They didn't have a large, diverse labor force to draw from. And so prior to the Depression, in El Salvador and Guatemala and some of the other countries in Central America, they tended to use security forces much like, say, the steel industry used brinks at the turn of the 20th century. Almost kind of a vigilante justice, keep people in order, keep things moving along, order and stability. And so there was this constant friction, certainly from the mid-19th century through the time of Depression, in countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and even in Panama and Costa Rica, and even to a certain extent in Belize. There was this tension that was omnipresent between those who owned the land, the employers, and those who worked the land, and they had to figure out how the police or the security forces fit into that relationship. Well, the Depression really through this delicate balance of power a curve. All of a sudden, as the world's economy came tumbling down, certainly market prices for sugar, for coffee, for tobacco and other goods grown or native indigenous to Central America, markets dried up, and workers were unemployed or underemployed. They have no means, had few means of subsistence. Historian many years ago, a man by the name of John Tutino, talked about what causes people to become violent. People, according to Tutino anyway, and I would agree with them, people don't become violent because they're poor. People become violent when they become desperate, when they're not able to provide for their children, when they don't have access to medicine, when they can't feed their families. That's kind of the line in the sand, the threshold. And when that threshold's crossed, then things can get very dicey. And throughout much of Central America in 1929, 1930, 1931, that threshold was crossed. A lot of people, this 96% in some of these countries of the population were pinched. And many of them became very desperate. And there were political agitators. I think the best example of a political agitator in Central American history, maybe, was Agustín Farabundo Martí in El Salvador. Martí was a Marxist agitator in El Salvador, and he was living during this time period in the coffee-growing country of El Salvador. People were unemployed. They were desperate. The balance of power, the relationship between the coffee families and their workers, it became very tenuous. And Martí began promoting strikes and very aggressive behavior on the part of these workers, demanding their rights, shutting down the businesses, really strangulating the national economy. Things got out of hand, and Martí, who's pretty quickly executed, lost control of it. And these coffee workers actually started going town to town breaking windows, destroying businesses. They actually murdered several merchants and landowners. It was really a stunning turn of events. I can certainly empathize with shop owners and landowners in the region. They thought they may well be killed. They probably felt like the French felt in Haiti when Louverture and his people rose up in the 1790s and the early 1800s. This is a problem. This is not a good time to be a coffee person in Salvadoran coffee country. Well, this is really kind of the turning point in modern Salvadoran history, but it also marks a turning point in modern Central American history that will help us understand some things that are happening today, right now in 2008 in Central America, which I'll explain here in a few moments. The president of El Salvador at that time was a general by the name of Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez. And Hernandez Martinez, when he learned what was happening in the countryside, brought his troops together, and they went out and responded, to borrow from current American vernacular, with shock and awe. And they really did respond with shock and awe. In a matter of a couple of days, security forces under President Hernandez Martinez's direction killed 30,000 people. And that number is a staggering number to think about. When we think, for example, about the Dirty War in Argentina, that's more people than died in the Dirty War in Argentina over a decade. The Salvadoran government, Salvadoran security forces, slaughtered that many people in very, very short order. And this really demonstrated to all observers, I think, in other countries, but certainly within El Salvador, that politicians, that landowners, that merchants, people who ran businesses, people who owned property, certainly in El Salvador, the message was, we will go to any lengths to maintain, if you will, progress and order. We're going to keep a lid on this, and we're going to continue functioning. We're not going to cave into anarchy, which is exactly what the Marxist agitators had been planning for. But in a broader sense, the slaughter of 30,000 people really was a shocking event. Throughout the remainder of the 20th century, following the Matanzas, certainly, and I apologize for making a big jump chronologically, but you have Somoza in Nicaragua, you're going to have Ubico in Guatemala, you've got leaders literally throughout Tiburcio, through Carillas and Honduras. Even Ramon we will have in Panama. You've got leaders throughout the region who, to a greater or lesser extent, are going to be following this model, if you will, of maintaining order in order to achieve progress, or at least in order to achieve political and economic stability. I want to stop here and make a point that I always make to my students, and I think it's an absolutely important thing to point out. Again, in the Central American countries, you're dealing with such limited resources, with such small populations of workers that you have very little wiggle room here. In 1893, an American historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner gave a very famous talk, actually published it, on the role of the frontier in American society. Certainly we, sitting in Provo, Utah, can appreciate the role of the frontier in American society. My wife's family crossed the plains with the pioneers in the Willie and Martin companies. Other groups, both Latter-day Saints and other groups, really used the frontier as a pressure valve to escape persecution, to escape tyranny, to start a new life. And in 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner was saying, okay, the age of the frontier is over. We're now moving into a new era. Well, many countries in Latin America have a proverbial frontier, if not a literal frontier. Argentina has its pampas. Brazil geographically is larger than the continental United States. It's huge. Chile is huge. Southern Chile is a tough place to conquer, if you will. A lot of these countries, Mexico, there's room in Argentina in the 1940s and 50s when Peronismo was taking off, or even today in Venezuela with Chavez. There's enough room to run and hide. There's enough room to carry out an insurgency. You don't have that much room in El Salvador. There's very little room to run and hide. There's no pressure valve, geographic or otherwise, where you can go and find relief, if you will, from the exigencies of the give and take between government and the people. There's really there are very few places to run and to hide if that's what you want to do. Well, this tenuous relationship, this game of ping pong back and forth between, on the one hand, the rulers of these countries and those who run the economies, and on the other hand, the workers, the military there in the middle serving as a sort of a buffer zone. This relationship continued through World War II and into the 1950s. You would have strikes. You would have the military going in and putting down strikes. It really picks up. I want to jump forward because during the Cold War, obviously after World War II, during the Cold War, this give and take between the governors and the governed takes on entirely new meaning. Now we're going to see both sides having access to more sophisticated weaponry, to ideological, indoctrination. You see a lot of other things going on that further complicate the already tenuous relationship between those who run the country and those who live in it. And we see a number of examples where literally all-out civil war erupts in the context of Central America in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.